Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Monday's edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour in association with Effective Artistry. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I'm joined by Brandon Tessers, LCPC Clinical Director of Effective Artistry, and Caitlin Miller, LCP and therapist with Effective Artistry. Hello, both.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you too. For anybody who's new to this stream, you're very welcome. As the title suggests, this is not therapy. It's open office hours. It's a chance for you to ask some questions of Brandon and Caitlin. We like to talk about all things neurodiversity and mental health. If you've got questions or comments, please feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll read them out on your behalf. And we usually start with a topic, but if something's on your mind and you want us to discuss that instead, then feel free to let us know and we'll go wherever you want us to go. Effective Artistry is a therapy practice, a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. So therapists at the practice are licensed to work with anyone in the state of Illinois. And there are also a couple of executive functioning coaches like myself, and we can work with you wherever you are in the world. So we work remotely. You can find out more by checking effectiveartistry.com or having a look at any of our many social networking links. You'll find us at Effective Artistry and at all the usual social media platforms. I think that's my spiel.
I love your spiel.
I feel like I rush it a little, but it'll get better with practice.
It's a lot to cover, and you do it well.
Yeah, it was nice pacing.
Thank you. So how are you both doing? What's been on your minds this week? This past week?
I woke up a few times last night, which I don't normally do as much, so I'm more tired than I thought, but I got good things done this weekend. So I was happy about it. It was a good weekend.
Cool.
Good.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Had a good weekend for sure. It's a tiring weekend, but that's just a lot of weekends with 3 young kids, and
Oof.
But nothing terrible. It's a wonderful thing that happened. It was great. And I'm doing well. Stressed in this moment, more stressed than I want to be. And working on that, but I'm doing all right. I'm glad to be here. Genuinely, it's nice. I like doing the stream.
It's fun.
Yeah, it is fun.
Yeah.
Well, I've had just over a week off. So we've had really bad weather here with Storm Babette. And I had taken a couple of days off at my other job last week. And my leave was extended because the building had to be shut for the weekend because of flooding and things like that. So I've had an extra long break.
Yeah.
And yet I find myself at the end of the week going, oh, there was all that stuff I planned to do that I didn't do. And I did a bunch of other stuff instead. But I'm okay with it.
Did you enjoy the other things you did instead?
I did. Yeah. There's a lot of sleeping at weird hours. So I think that's something we talked about sleep last week. That's something I still need to work on. But yeah, I got to do some nice things. I'm getting back into cooking again. Something I used to really enjoy doing, and I just haven't been into it for a while. So getting back into it again, and it's really relaxing and fun.
I'm going to clarify, just because your dialect to me for a second, it sounded like you said you're getting back into cocaine again.
No, cooking. Yeah, for anybody listening, cooking.
Didn't catch that, but I'm glad that you clarified that.
Oh, it was very clear immediately afterwards. At first, I was like, she must be making some joke about cocaine. Oh, no, she's not being. Oh, it must. Okay, cooking. I said dialect. I don't think it's a dialect thing. I think it was just I just misheard a thing.
I feel like it's dialect because it's like cooking, okay.
I don't know.
I feel like there are some vowels that get a little bit bent If that makes sense.
Does make sense
Mm.
from a certain perspective. You know, I
But
used
what
to
is
do a lot of
bent
dialect work.
anyway?
Well, that's the thing. That would happen.
Sorry,
You're the
our
one with the
vowels are
dialect.
so bent.
Yeah.
We have bendy vowels here in the States.
My undergraduate degree is in acting, and one of my professors, my favorite professor, was very specialized in dialect work, and even worked on like the Lord of the Rings,
That totally tracks.
the Hobbit films, not the Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
but the Hobbit ones. And I love dialect work.
Yeah, that would be. I feel like if you would have stayed in acting, you would have done that.
She brought me, when she was directing a show, she brought me in to help with the dialect coaching for her
Fun.
cast. Yeah.
Ooh.
I mean, dialect work is very along. I mean, same thing, right? Like I listen very closely to the things that people are saying, even to information that other ears or other minds or whatever would say is irrelevant. Like you just need to know what the word is that's being said, and I hear tone more than other people might think is necessary. Can't always replicate that, although I'm pretty decent at.
It sounds situationally advantageous, Brandon.
It is. It's a sensitivity, and it definitely falls under the umbrella of auditory data, because it is auditory data, but it could be more specific, or it could be social or whatever. But yes, I pay a lot of attention without even consciously choosing to what people are saying.
Yeah.
Even more than people tend to pay to themselves when they're speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you're not doing cocaine.
I'm not doing cocaine. No.
I was gonna ask you if you're because I'm trying to popularize this term. Are you kitchen witching?
Yes, a little bit. I've been kitchen witching today.
And that is witch with a W, if anyone misheard that.
But with the age or no? Anyway. What are we talking about today? Does anybody have a thing?
I'm curious about when you talked about being stressed and stress and how you're perceiving it and what you're focusing on, or how you feel it in your body, or I don't even know. I think it's interesting when people. I'm curious how you relate to the concept of being stressed.
You asked more specific questions, but a bunch of them, and then you like rolled it up into one. Can you go back to being specific?
How are you feeling stress in this moment?
That's still.
Are you feeling stress in your body in this moment? That's more specific.
So I'll say for me, the Brandon's like categorical definitions of words and things. To me, all emotion, like all feeling, is something which entails both a physical sensation and a cognitive experience.
Okay, so then what is your physical sensation paired with your cognitive experience of stress in this moment?
So physically, break it down. Physically, I feel it in my chest, which is most common for me, is to feel stress in my chest.
Yeah.
And especially over the last, I would say, 6 months or so, very specifically feel it around like where I would think that my heart is, like just left of center kind of thing. And like have trouble getting deep breaths, like shallow breaths. It feels like there's something in my abdomen that's like not making as much room for my lungs to inflate and everything to move. It's like putting pressure on everything else. Yeah. Physically. I do also sometimes, especially more so lately, I will notice like my heart, my pulse speeding up. I'll feel my pulse going faster, and sometimes like trembling fingers.
How do you notice? I don't know if I notice that in my, is it similar to like if you're doing cardio exercise and how do you notice your pulse increasing?
Well,
do you like hear it, or do you I don't even know how that works.
I think, I don't actually know this, so we can experiment with this right now. I think that the data I'm picking up is something that people universally pick up.
Okay.
but our attentional processes don't notice it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd be interested to see if the two of you can sense this too. But for me, it's not really a sound. It's a feeling of like pressure, but it is in the like, I don't know, temple, ear canal kind of area that if I focus in, I can feel even like both the badum.
That's so interesting because you said that and I heard the beat in my ear and then I felt it and it was the beat. I think I just don't.
Yeah, it's data.
I'm not directing my attentional
right.
process.
It's always there, so it's not something that we pay much attention to.
Wow.
And I've only really started noticing it more recently, in particular because I've gotten real nervous about like, oh no, is something going on with my heart or my blood pressure or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm more aware of that stuff for sure. But yeah, those are typically the stuff that'll go along with stress physically. And then cognitively, it's about whatever thing I am thinking about that's stressful. Like if I just experience those things without a cognitive component of something, like thinking about something that is stressful to me, then I would be like, oh no, what's going on? Like, am I having a heart attack, or is this an effect? Did I eat too much of this or not enough of that? Or I wouldn't think of it as psychological or emotional or whatever. But yeah, I'm thinking about things which are stressful, less so now that we're talking about it, which is part of why I look forward to this stream. But I tend to, again, I think universal, different, extremities and whatever. But when I get stressed, I will get very, very focused in on whatever thing I'm thinking about sometimes, and very rapidly get into thinking like worst case scenarios, as we've talked about, that when you're thinking about something, the longer you think about it.
So does it usually start with like, I'm observing this thing in my life that is observable and does exist, and then you go into this may happen in the future, and then you go into this worst case scenario may happen? Is that how it usually works for you?
Well,
looking for a rule.
What I would say is, so the way I talk about it with clients is that cognition, you can't figure out what will work by thinking about it.
Yeah.
You can just poke holes in things, right? Like if I'm trying to say like, how do I get down from the top of this 10-story building? Okay, I could jump. Nope, that's not a good idea because I can cognitively think through what would happen. So that's not an option. I can write it off. Well, I could wait here for a helicopter, but that I don't have control over that, whatever. You can run through things and you can poke holes in them and say, that won't work, that's too costly, that's risky, whatever. Mm-hmm. You can eliminate ideas. But you can't ever say, oh, this will definitely work. You can say, I'm running through, and everything I can think of, I don't see any reason that this won't work. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it will work. So cognition is always, it's just about poking holes in potential solutions. It's never about identifying what will definitely work. And separately but related, like Venn diagram overlap of that, is that if I'm trying to make predictions about how something will go, rather than like solving a problem, I'm trying to figure out if there even is going to be a particular problem. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's this thing coming up and it could go this way, and hey, that'd be great. If it goes that way, that's awesome. What is there left to think about? Right. There's nothing to continue to think. Okay, it could go this way. Well, that'd be a little problem, but if that happens, I'll just do this thing and it'll be fine.
Done.
So every possibility that you consider, if it's either not a problem or if it's a problem that you can resolve, you quickly resolve it and move on. If you continue to think about the possibilities, you'll eventually get to something that you're like, oh, I don't even know what I would do about that. Like, now I got to think about. So the longer you think about it, the worse and worse and worse possibilities you get to.
And then if you take it to the worst possibility, does it usually end up being something about you dying?
Well, in one way or another, yeah. Not me specifically. That's the
or people you
general, yeah. Because that's the ultimate, universally, that's the ultimate problem. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what you think cognitively about the idea of it or feel emotionally about the idea of it, you are constructed. Every cell in your body is constructed to persist in what it is doing.
So if a neurodivergent person had an increased heart rate that they noticed in their ears, and sort of like the chest clenching and a cognition of this thing is going to happen and it might go really poorly and this maybe is the really poor way it will go, then what would you say to a client like that when they said, Brendan, I don't want to feel this way?
Well, it would depend on certain things.
What about if that
Are
client
you
were
trying
Brandon?
to be helping me right now?
What if that client were you? Was you? Were you? English. Would you like this coaster? Because my mug is not hot.
No, I'm alright. This
You're
is
okay.
empty.
Oh, okay.
Again, it depends, but because there's different possibilities, right? Like one thing that does happen is that you feel the physical elements associated with the thing before the cognitive elements, and then you come to the like if you were to feel those things, like if you were to notice your pulse and blah 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 without any like thought that you can quickly say, yes, this is the thing I'm stressed about or whatever, then instead your first response would be like, what is going on? Or you wouldn't be noticing it, right? It could happen without you noticing it consciously, but if you're noticing it, your first thought is going to be, what is going on? Why is this happening? Which can then, the stressful thought at that point can just be, oh no, what is happening to me? Why is this happening? Or whatever. But it can also lead to what we call perception matching, where if I'm feeling the physical elements associated with stress, but not thinking anything stressful, then I'll likely say, I feel stressed. Why do I feel stressed? And then I start running through everything. Is it this? No. Is it this? No. Is it this? Oh yeah, that's really stressing me out. And so even though I wasn't thinking it when it started, I quickly come to it.
This is what I worry about people who have a history of anxiety or like depression or whatever it is. And perhaps they actually have an underlying health condition, but they feel some sort of negative signal in their body and they don't have an associated cognition, but then they associate it with a cognition and then they say, oh, well, my body feels awful, but
that's exactly why I push so hard on like getting rid of the idea of subconscious, whatever. Like, oh, I'm subconsciously stressed about this thing. If you weren't aware of it, then you weren't aware of it. Now, yes, things can be in our working memory that is like we're slightly or to some extent aware of without a lot of detail. A common version of that is like, I know there's something I'm supposed to be doing, I just don't know what it is, right? Like you can have something that you're aware of without a lot of detail to it. But if there's nothing you're aware of that's stressful and then you come to it. Now, even that happens for a reason, right? Because it might be that I am sensing or picking up on some data indicative of that something's off or whatever, but I just don't consciously recognize what it is. So the body response, the physical response happens first and then prompts me to start looking for what is it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But yes, that's why I try so hard to make sure that people understand that, like we were talking about last week, like biology is involved in this. That if you think of everything as being psychological, that everything is rooted in psychology, then you will overlook everything else and jump straight to the psychological.
Well, and it could be what is it called? A chicken versus the chicken before.
Just the chicken and the egg, whatever.
Yeah.
In the sense of, let's say maybe someone was anxious during most of their childhood, and then around 21, the heart palpitations, they were still associated with anxiety until they then pass out at age 32 of like a heart issue because the entire time. So it's like, it's interesting how they can kind of go back and forth. And then I think about like the sexism and the sort of hysteria stuff that happens in the medical field, where if you come in and you say that you're really struggling, sometimes doctors are like, well, you have a history of anxiety, so I don't really know if we need to check this out because it's probably just anxiety.
Yeah, lots of things get written off as being anxiety. And part of the reason that I focus a lot on like the other side of things is it's not to say that the psychology doesn't matter, because I said, yes, sometimes you get the physical sensation first, then the cut. But plenty of times it's the other way, where you're thinking
totally.
about something and then your body starts responding to it. And sometimes it's more or less, or at least for all practical purposes, happens simultaneously, right?
We've got a comment in the chat. Thank you for joining us again. What is the root cause of compulsive behaviors, like addiction to certain things? I want to stop my addiction, but I just fall again. I'm not sad or upset state of mind.
That's a great question, and a perfect example of why we don't always want to just focus immediately on the psychological, because that right there, and I could be misinterpreting your question, please let me know if I am, but that right there, it shows in our culture we tend to talk about whatever thing that we're referring to as being addictive, or that whatever the person is addicted to. We mostly talk about it as like a coping thing. So like, of course, no rational person, there's no logical reason that a person would do this, except that things are really bad and therefore they're doing things which are bad for them, etc. And of course, a lot of the things that people are addicted to, we can pretty confidently say, yeah, that's not great for you to do. In philosophy, they talk about consider the counterpositive, the contrapositive, the thing which is not happening. So that's mostly where that kind of thing is rooted in. Talking about escapism or coping or whatever, it's like, okay, well, what's the thing that would be happening if you weren't doing whatever it is you're doing? This is not obviously about the commenter who didn't say, but for the ease of our conversation, we'll say drugs, just as a blanket. That's what we're talking about. That the general kind of popular thought is people do drugs because they're really suffering or struggling emotionally or whatever, and it's a way to escape. Great. Now, of course, there's other things which are not happening. Like, what other things could be done that might help them to also avoid feeling the stress and the whatever. But the simple answer, or not simple, the general answer is, if a person is doing a thing, it is their best option of what to do in that moment. And that if you want them to do something different, which we want all the time, we need to provide them with better options. Sorry, I'll read out loud. Okay, yeah, you're right. I'm not addicted to bad habits because I'm upset or escapism. I literally can't stop doing certain behaviors, no matter how much I say to myself. I just do it anyway. Another way of looking at it is to talk about this when I do executive functioning work. I talk about negative aims versus positive aims. A negative aim being something that you're trying to reduce or eliminate, negative, subtract it from your experience, where a positive aim is something that you're trying to acquire or increase. Approaching addiction in that way, calling it addiction, approaching it in the way that people generally do, is that negative aim kind of way, meaning what you're aiming to do is to not do the behavior. Yeah. That is difficult and taxing, because you can not do the behavior for 2 days and then still do it anyway, and now you failed. So it's kind of like in every moment, some of your resources have to go toward not doing the thing. You could literally go 40 years without, again, we'll go back to drugs. You can go 40 years clean and sober and then do it again and say, oh, I failed. That's a very fragile kind of, because what happens when you look at it that way is you go 2 weeks clean and then you relapse and you say, oh, I was doing so good, and you're mad at yourself. And then you go 20 years clean and you relapse and you're even more mad. 20 years, what's wrong with me? I'm so broken. Even after 20 years, I still go back to this thing. But objectively speaking, if what you're trying to do is not engage, not do the drugs, going 20 years without doing them is much better than going 2 weeks without doing them. So what we would want, rationally, what we would want is to look at those 20 years and say, okay, I did a lot of stuff that was really beneficial in this regard. What was that stuff and how do I build on it? But instead, if we look at it as, no, I'm not supposed to do the thing and I did it anyway, then I throw away all of that and say, whatever I did, it didn't work. I still failed anyway, even after 20 years. So now I'm starting from scratch, which is part of why I think people will jump so quickly to like, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, why do I keep doing this? Because we're treating it as though nothing that we did worked, instead of saying, no, this helped in that way and this helped in that way.
So are you saying then the positive aims would be, what did I do in that 20 years that I really enjoyed, and then having the positive aim of doing those things that you really enjoyed, which would then maybe also cease the drug use in the meantime, in the present moment?
Some maybe, and some no.
Yeah.
Partly because you can't fool yourself. So if you're looking at it as, I have to do X so that I don't do the drugs, then you're still,
I don't mean
you're
it
still
in that
aiming
way.
at the drugs.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm clarifying. Is
No, it's helpful.
I don't think you are, but we want to make sure that people don't think of it that way.
Yeah.
It's kind of like,
I'm gonna fool myself.
Sometimes I'll be working with parents of teens, especially, who are struggling with whatever they're struggling with. And every attempt to help them, everything the parent does to try and help them, makes them angry. Because what's very common.
The teen or the parent?
Teen.
Yeah.
Because it'll be very common. It's especially common in this relationship, but it's in a lot of different ones. It's very common that part of what a person is struggling with is feeling like they shouldn't need help, and that they shouldn't be burdening those around them. And so every time someone around them tries to help, it makes them feel worse, and they get angry and they say, just leave me alone, and whatever. So sometimes I'll be working with someone, especially parents in that situation, and they'll say, okay, so in order to help them, we just have to leave them alone. And I'll say, no, because that still started with, in order to help them, which means that if they're thinking at all, well, now they're just trying to give me space because they think that's what's going to help me, they're accurate. So they might sense that you're still doing something to try and help them.
Is that an example of a negative aim?
Which?
I'm going to ignore them as a form of trying to help them?
No, that wouldn't be about the aim. That's different. A strategy.
Okay. The
aim is to be helpful to the kid.
Okay.
Ignoring them is a strategy or an intervention or whatever to attempt to get there. So no, if it comes back to, I'm just trying to get myself not to do the thing, it's rooted in self-judgment. It means that any time in which you do the thing, you'll still look at it as a failure and whatever.
Yeah.
Now the part that's kind of a maybe yes is looking at what are all the things that I've been doing that I've enjoyed, and let's do more of those things. That's always a great thing to do. Like to see, what do I enjoy and how do I do more of it? That's always a good thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the thing that would change the addictive behavior. It's not, because again, not every time you engage in the addictive behavior is it because you don't have enough enjoyment in your life.
Yeah, totally. So, and that's great to clarify.
But so it will help with some of it, or at least some of the time. And even if it doesn't, it's still a great thing to do.
Yeah.
Now, taking it off of drugs for a second, although I think this is what I'm about to say is very relevant to drugs too. There's something that I refer to as the float, just because I think it's an evocative way to talk about it, which is when you get to a point where your resources are so low, particularly energy of certain kind or whatever, right? You have such little energy that you really can't do very much. So this is all in that cost and value kind of lens. So you have very few resources, so you can't do anything that's very high cost, only very low cost things.
Yeah.
And you're not like, it's the day's not over, you're not ready to like go to sleep or whatever, big thing to transition. So you just have this time, it's 4 p.m, and I'm not going to go to bed until 10 or whatever. So I've got 6 hours to kill. Whenever we're talking about killing time, wasting time, whatever, then there's kind of this mental calculus of like, okay, what can I do? What can I afford to do for 6 hours until it's time to go to sleep? And when you have very low energy, there's a pretty limited subset of things that you'll be able to do. And for the most part, the stuff that you're going to be doing is stuff that has value. It replenishes your energy to some extent, but not a lot. To the point that it's more or less, this is why I call it the float, it's more or less neutral. Like everything it takes for me to put into it, every moment I get that much back out of it.
Well, that feels like a really difficult place to be in.
So like doom scrolling for me would be something that almost always means you're in the float. It's like I'm doing this thing. I don't even super like it. I don't like hate it per se. And I just keep going and keep going and keep going. And yes, a lot of the things that people will start to talk about as addictions fall into this category. But I want to be clear that that stuff, even when it can fall into this category, like social media, for example, there are plenty of other times and other ways in which you use those things or engage with those things that isn't this. Just because you can do social media or watch infinite YouTube videos or play video games or read a book, or honestly, as ridiculous as it sounds, rumination and perseveration is a version of it. I'm so low on energy, all I can do is just sit here and think about things, and it's not really enjoyable, but I'm continuing to do it. Well, that's a very nice comment. Thank you for the advice, Howard. The three of you so insightful.
Oh, that's really sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very nice.
And hello, Boston Cider. I hope you're able to stay connected even despite the coffee shop Wi-Fi. Thanks for being with us again.
So when the addictive behaviors fall into that category of thing, where it's kind of just, it's the thing that you start doing when your energy is so low that you can't really do anything else, then you want to look at, how do I make it so that I don't get that low where I get into the float? Like, what can I change outside of that? It's a big part of it is that people will think, when they think that the point is to not engage in the addictive behavior, that they think that it's accomplished through some like effort of will, like some mental whatever. But the whole point, at least in this category of things, is that by the time you get to the point where you're doing the thing, you don't have the energy to put into overriding your default anymore. That's kind of the point. You had energy to override it, and you were until you get low enough that you can't anymore. You can't do it all the time. So one way of looking at it is, what else is going on? What else can we change to bring down the costs that you're paying, or increase the resources that you're replenishing and whatever, so that you don't get into the float. Another way of looking at it is to find replacement behaviors once you're in the float. If you're saying, okay, I'm going to be there sometimes, but I'd still rather not do this thing, then you got to find something else that can be your new float activity and try and use that. Again, though, that's tricky because you still have to override your habitual default response. And by the time you're getting to the float, it's very difficult to say, oh, I'm going to engage in that new thing. It's like, tomorrow I'll do it. Today I'm just still going to do the same old thing. Another way to look at it is, when you do get to that point, when you get that low, are there things that you can do that are not just float, where you can actually get a net positive? So sometimes even things like, instead of doom scrolling, I'm going to take a nap kind of deal. And napping, again, doesn't always work because you can't always make yourself go to sleep.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, something that actually does quite help people a lot, certain types of people, and obviously what I'm about to say, I'm going to talk about eating food, which can in and of itself be something that would be considered an addictive behavior, or something that you're doing to stimulate yourself in the float and whatever. But yeah, sometimes it's when you're starting to get real stressed out and looping on something and whatever, like eating food is something that's a net positive energy and gets you out of it. A very, very common pattern I see is people who, after school or after work, at the end of the day, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, come home and immediately think that they should be doing some other like difficult and draining and productive tasks. And they find themselves unable to do that. And rather than rest or engage in some kind of restorative behavior or something that gives you energy, because you think you're not supposed to do that because that's just addictive behavior or whatever, instead you just sit in your head and beat the crap out of yourself about, why am I not doing my homework? Why am I not cleaning the house? Why am I not working on that painting I was going to work on? Why am I not blah, blah, blah? Why am I not going to the gym like I keep saying I'm going to, and blah, blah, blah. That makes it worse.
Yeah.
So you don't tend to get much energy back. It takes longer. Where if you came home at that same time, I was like, yeah, it's the end of the day. Like, I just spent a lot of energy at work or at school. I'm not going to try and jump straight into doing something else that's also more draining than it is rewarding or whatever. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to engage in this thing that's energizing or exciting or rejuvenating. And then at 7 or 8 or 10 or whenever I feel like it, or maybe not at all today or whatever, come back and try again.
I think that's the main kind of stuck pattern that I find people in, is some version of, I go to work, either like I do really well at work, I do moderately well at something, and then I come home and there's nothing left and I beat myself up until I eventually drift into sleep.
Yeah.
So would the idea be you come home, you do a low-cost rejuvenating activity, and then you either continue various forms of that are pleasurable until you fall asleep, or you do it for a certain amount of time where you do feel replenished energy, and then you can engage in higher cost tasks that would fall into like homework, cleaning the house, like things that people...
That's one way to do it, yeah. The optimal way to me is to make changes so that you're not getting home in that state.
Mm.
This is the reason that I hit over and over and over again the studies that show that on average, people engage when their whole job is intellectual labor, which includes all academia, all students.
Does it include therapy?
Yeah. if your job is not pure physical labor.
Are you sure I'm not a farmer? That's really hard too. I'm not trying to...
No, and the thing is that those are not pure physical labor.
That's true. Yes.
There's still a lot of cognition involved in that. When we're talking about pure physical labor, I'm talking about like completely automatic, manualized tasks. Like I don't have experience with this to know for sure, but what I imagine working on an assembly line to be, that there's not a lot of like,
move this thing to this thing.
You do the same thing over and over and over and over and over. So it really doesn't take a lot of cognition. And I could be wrong about how that works, but that's my idea of it.
Yeah.
But other than that, you're engaged in intellectual labor. Now, most of the things like farming and the trades and whatever that we would call, like generally people would say, oh, that's more physical labor. Probably, this is just an assumption based on how humans operate, probably works out that they're doing about 2.5 hours worth of intellectual labor spread out over the 8 hours worth of physical
I noticed
labor.
that when I saw a maintenance person the other day. They were helping me out with something, and I was like, there's a looking at the problem, analyzing it, thinking of the solutions that have already been tried, thinking of the system that they're fixing. And so I did notice a portion of that. And I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense.
That's the vast majority of what we as a species have done. So what we're particularly built for is that pattern of get some information, think about it a little bit to come to an idea of what to try, and then execute. But the execution takes a lot more time than the thinking does.
Yeah.
And the getting information takes a lot more time than the thinking does. We're built for, let me take in a lot of information, think a little bit, try something. And as I'm trying something, I'm getting a lot more information too, think a little bit. So it should be cycling really fast. Anyway.
We have a question. Are we taking more questions from the chat? Yes.
Yes.
I think we missed one of your questions. So go back. Yeah, and thank you, Boston Cider, for your comments. Boston Cider is only getting like every 5th word because their Wi-Fi connection keeps dropping out. But they're sticking with us. Thank you. Okay, so question from earlier was, what made each of you venture into psychology? What piqued your interest, and what made you do this amazing thing for the rest of your life? Well, whether we do it for the rest of our lives is a whole other ballgame.
I really do like that question. I want to give my best answer. Questions like this, I get asked versions of this question a lot. Like anytime you're doing an interview or whatever, people ask about what led you to this. And there's just a lot of different ways to answer the question. You can kind of tell the story of where you got to, like the things that happened in the order that they happened, or you can talk about why you are motivated to, or whatever. I'll say as a way to like try and combine different answers. Doing this as a profession is something that I more or less fell into. You know, like it was a reactive decision.
Interesting.
I was doing other work and got into doing like academic work, and in doing academic work started to encounter things and whatever, and just eventually came to the conclusion of you can't, it's not so simple that you can just separate all these things out from one another. You can't approach, why is this person struggling to do their homework, without being aware of the fact that they're a whole person with lots of different stuff. It's not just, oh, well, they don't know how to take notes or whatever, although that's often helpful. So there's that like, it just, one thing led to another until it got to a point where I went to school for this, and then going to school for it, I've met people and they connected me with things and blah, blah, blah. But the other way, I don't know if this is what people, it seems like this is more what people are interested in knowing. I don't know. I have always paid very close attention to what people say. I don't know why or how. We can speculate about a bunch of different things, but I do very specifically remember being as young as like 7 or 8 years old and seeing two people talking and then starting to get like confrontational with one another. And to me, it's so clear that what that person just said, they meant it this way, but that person interpreted it this way and responded to it that way. I remember being that age and saying, no, she was saying blah, 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 and he thought you were saying blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, is that right? Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then it's fine. I don't know. I pay attention to what people say. People are fascinating to me. I think it's all fascinating. I don't know how people walk around thinking things, like being conscious and not ever being like, well, that's weird. Like, what is this that I can just think and then sometimes every night I don't think for a while, for like 8 hours. Like, that's weird. So I don't know. What about you?
That's lovely. My undergrad is in opera, and I wanted to do something that studied the nature of reality and the complexity of consciousness, and the scientific route would have caused me to have to take additional undergraduate courses and probably a master's, and then the psychological route had the option of just doing a master's. And also I've had people in my life suffer from really, really, really difficult things emotionally, and I thought this could be a way to sort of, I don't know, honor the people in my life who have suffered so much. Yeah, was that an answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
like, I think I probably would have chosen particle physics if I could have done it in 2 years. So
I don't think I could do any job that
so
wasn't
joyful.
Working directly with people.
Yeah, I think I do kind of want to hide from people, but then I don't know. Yeah.
What about you, Marie?
Well, as you know, I fell into this kind of by accident, but thanks to you inviting me to train as a coach. I've always just liked helping people, and yeah, a bit like that. I don't think I would enjoy a job where I wasn't directly interacting with other people. I guess I came late to a diagnosis of ADHD as well. And in learning about all of that, I wanted to help other people learn about it. Yeah. I don't know. I just like learning about how people tick.
Yeah, this is part of that whole social sensitivity idea I keep putting out there is just like other sensitivities, we can theorize about how a person becomes that way, including theorizing that there's some element of it which is genetic and pre-programmed and whatever. Although the more I think about it, the less I put stock in that kind of thing.
Even regarding epigenetics, like there's some predisposed.
No, not regarding epigenetics, but
yeah.
Epigenetics in our field is just a fancy way of saying, yeah, when things happen, it affects you and you change.
Not quite. I think that's how people use it colloquially. But I guess there's no way to prove if they have some sort of genetic predisposition. So then it just sounds like we're trying to loop in some science.
Not only can we not prove it, like in an individual case, it's not something which can be proven at all.
Yeah.
The only way we can look at something and say, like, for example, something that is fairly well regarded being a gene that correlates with being alcoholic, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's something that people, it's not very controversial to say that there's a genetic component to that. Even that, though, we find that by observing who is alcoholic and then looking at their genes and seeing which genes they have in common with one another, and looking at people who are not alcoholic and seeing what those genes have in common and how are they different. But of course, even in then, there are plenty of people who we would call alcoholic who don't have that gene, and plenty of people who have that gene and are not alcoholic.
Yeah.
So there's, I think of it a lot as a particular logical fallacy called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Oh, I remember you talking about that.
Which is, it's called that because the idea is that a Texan man goes outside his barn and shoots a bunch of bullets at the side of his barn, and then afterwards walks up to the wall, looks at the densest cluster of bullets, and draws the target around it. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is we've observed an array of data, and then we draw, we group together specific groupings of that data, and then we make the mistake of thinking that data grouped that way because of how we defined it, instead of the fact that we're just defining something which we observed as having been grouped together. So do the genes make someone alcoholic? No, by definition, they don't. What makes somebody alcoholic is if they have a relationship with alcohol that we would, falls under certain parameters, and we would call it to be alcoholic. So that's what I mean with the epigenetics thing is, yes, it doesn't matter in an individual instance, because what are we going to do? Even if we did identify that it has to do with your genes, what do we do about that?
We have a miniature robot enter your body and edit your genetic code.
The big thing about epigenetics, and I think people tend to focus on the side of epigenetics, which is environmental and experiential things like activate certain genes or whatever.
Yeah, that's what they mostly are talking about.
But that's not, at least to my knowledge, that's not the revolutionary part of the idea of epigenetics. That's something that everybody's already we've always known you have the potential for a thing, but until something happens, it doesn't unlock or happen or whatever. The part to me that I think epigenetics as a field is more focused on is the idea that what happens in your life then changes your genes. Not that you're genetically predisposed for a thing which can be activated, but that your experiences actually do, your DNA modifies in response to what you experience. And so therefore then gets passed down biologically through your progeny, right?
Yeah.
That again, not my specialty, but to the element, to my knowledge, the big thing that started this was looking at trauma specifically, and specifically looking at Holocaust survivors and seeing that their genes changed during that experience, and then those things in the genes passed down. And the idea that the change is trauma and whatever, that's a useful and valid and whatever idea, but that's what we're observing is that when a group of people experienced a similar set of experiences, their genes changed in ways that continued. That's what's interesting to me about epigenetics.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just another version of saying I was born this way, or I was destined to be this.
Is that a Lady Gaga song?
Well, it is, but I think born this way.
It's not the only context it's used.
And of course, that particular phrase is big in the LGBTQIA plus communities, which I respect and understand.
Love.
Well, love the communities.
I love the communities.
Yeah, I love the communities.
Yes.
I'm talking about the usage of the phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, the usage of the phrase I respect and I understand, but don't necessarily love. Because there's something called biological determinism. The idea that a person's biology determines everything about them and their life. And there is biological determinism, but what I was talking about is biological essentialism.
Yeah.
That who you are just boils down to your biology. And I don't think it's that simple. And to say
Wait,
born
Brandon,
this way,
it's not that simple. I've never heard you say something like that. I'm shocked.
But to say I was born this way, if we interpret that to mean I did not choose to be this way, and I have no ability to consciously choose to be any different. Absolutely, 100%. But it can also be interpreted in the sense of it was predetermined and I was destined to be exactly who I am, and there's nothing I can do to be any different. And of course, in the context of being LGBTQIA plus, I wouldn't want anyone to be any different.
Yeah.
But in the context that we work in, mental health, neurodiversity, whatever, there's plenty of ways in which I can say, yes, I am neurodivergent and I don't want to change that about myself essentially. But here are some things that I experience or that I do that I don't love that are attached to that, and I would like to change it. And when we say nothing I can do, that leads back to what you were talking about earlier, where it's part of that cycle of, well, I'm depressed and that's why I'm exhausted all the time. And I can't even sleep well because I'm depressed. And so then people say, well, yeah, you're depressed because you're exhausted. And they'll say, no, I'm exhausted because I'm depressed, which is an accurate statement. But nobody wants that to continue. And so the point of being able to explain or justify or point out like some chain of events of something is not just to feel better about understanding why it's happening. It's to be able to start to try and make changes. Like if you understand what leads to why, what causes why to happen, if you don't like what why is, the point is that we can then start to make some changes in order to try and make the outcome different.
I'm getting distracted because I'm thinking about just the language of I am depressed. And I'm curious, well, this is a causal thing, but what social change could be made if we used phrases like, I am this is so much longer, but I am currently experiencing depression, or I have been experiencing depression for a very long time, because I do think that there is, so would that count as biological essentialism? Okay,
I see where you're going, I think, and let me make sure I responded to it, because I think what you're saying is a good, valid point. And this is one of those things where it's like the solution to one problem is its own problem, and the solution to that, and eventually you get back to the original problem.
Yeah, that sounds like my life.
I have a related question. It's kind of connected to where you're going with language here, and back to what we were talking about at the beginning with stress. So I see the phrase autistic burnout used a lot, rather than just burnout. And so I'm wondering, if you tell yourself you have autistic burnout, are you telling yourself that it's different from any other form of burnout and somehow inescapable or harder to overcome? Or
I feel like some people do view it as inescapable. I think some people do view it as completely different. I think the people that I've heard talk about it that I find quite compelling, it's more about a Venn diagram. Like there are some signs of neurotypical burnout and some signs of autistic burnout and some overlap, but that talking about like the sensory aspects of it, or talking about the social aspects of it, or various forms of like conceptualizing. Do you want to say something, Brendan?
No.
Okay, I just heard you. I heard you breathe.
Yeah, I feel like I'm breathing shallowly. I've been doing that this whole session. I'm trying to like get myself to take deeper breaths.
Oh wow.
Sorry.
No, I'm glad to hear you're trying to take deeper breaths. So anyway, does that feel like any sort of answer, Marie? I don't know.
Yeah. It's just when you mentioned, I'm experiencing depression versus I am depressed, it got me thinking about that again. Like how we frame it. Does that frame our response to it, or how we approach managing it?
Totally.
That one definitely.
Yeah.
And I would say the first thing you said, are they talking about it as though it is something different? And I would say yes, by definition, if
they're using another word.
Right. Linguistically, if I add an adjective onto a thing, I am specifying that thing as being opposed to other versions of that thing. So autistic burnout, a person could either mean that of all the things which are burnout, there's a subset of those things which are autistic burnout, and I'm talking about that specific subset. Or they could be talking about two separate things which may or may not overlap, and I'm talking about autistic burnout versus burnout.
I think people who I know who have used the phrase autistic burnout usually are the second thing you're talking about.
I think that is often the case, yeah.
But not always.
Because of, or not because of, I think that when I was saying because, I'm saying why I believe I believe that is often the case because oftentimes when people are talking about neurodivergence or autism or anything specifically, often they are saying it as a separate, like as opposed to neurotypical, which I have said many times, I think is not the most helpful way to look at this.
Yeah.
Part of the burnout thing specifically is burnout's not a thing that like we observe. You know what I mean? Like it's a word that we're using to describe a set of experiences. But any two people saying that they are in burnout or experiencing burnout, they might mean some of the same stuff. They might mean completely separate things, whatever. Including that burnout often is used as like a colloquial thing, like, oh, I'm just so burnt out on this or whatever. Where I do think a lot of the time when people are saying autistic burnout, they're specifying this isn't just I'm bored of a thing or I'm feeling stuck in a rut, burnt out in that kind of a way. I mean like a medical condition kind of burnout, which I do think that many people mean when they say burnout without putting autistic on it as well.
Yeah.
That's over the last 3 years, I think it's been talking about burnout as though it is like a medical state is one of those things.
It's interesting you say that because I sort of think of part of the movement of talking, and I know I've never actually talked to anyone about this, but part of the movement of it is depathologizing anxiety and depression, because if it goes from, oh, I'm anxious and depressed all the time to I'm really burnt out, I feel like for some people they feel sometimes more empowered and also other times less pathologized, like there's not something broken in me, I'm burnt out, which means my environment has caused X, Y, or Z. So I'm not saying that that's better.
Yeah. And in that context, when people say autistic burnout, they're often meaning that even though other people might not think that my life or my environment would cause me to burn out,
exactly,
it does because I'm autistic, and they just don't understand because they're not, which is valid. But again, a lot of this is reliant on this idea that burnout is like a identifiable physiological state, which it isn't.
Yeah.
You know, it certainly correlates to certain things, but and this goes back to what you were saying about depressed too, because what you're saying is actually how people arrived at identity first, or I'm sorry, person first language, to say, oh, I'm not autistic, I am a person with autism, which autistic people by and large will push back against. Because in both cases, the reason that we would be separating the person from the thing is because we're saying it's bad to be the thing. Now, it's different with depression because you're not going to find anybody who is arguing that feeling depressed is a preferable way to feel.
Or it's a very rare subset of people.
Sure, yeah. But yes, it is a response. So this is the funny thing, is that what we're referring to as depathologizing now. Pathologizing those things was in and of itself a way to depathologize those things originally. Originally, you say you're depressed or you're anxious, and people are saying, oh, get over it, you're just weak, whatever. So then we talk about it as, no, this is a medical condition, to destigmatize it. But to destigmatize it that way, we then turned it into a medical thing. And now we have this next problem of sometimes that means that people are saying there's nothing I can do. For example, widely held theory, like to the point that people think that it's just true, the chemical imbalance theory, that depression is a result of a chemical imbalance in the brain. There is every moment, every day, there's more and more and more research showing that no, that's not how this works. What a lot of us have been saying for a long time. But it was very useful to say, this isn't a thing I can choose. I was born this way. But then the flip side of that sometimes is that it locks you in and saying, well, because I justified this by telling everyone, including myself, that I can't do anything to change it, well, now I can't do anything to change it.
So it's disempowering.
Right. And I would say it has a lot to do with, to the point that it is empowering, what you said earlier, calling it burnout or burnout can be empowering. It is, and it can be. But the reason that it is, or the extent to which it is because it is a justification. Meaning, if I were to just say, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm experiencing, whatever, and then other people are like, oh, whatever, you're just complaining, get over it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But then I can justify it as, no, this is burnout or autistic burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Now I feel empowered to like own it, even if other people disagree and say I shouldn't feel the way that I feel.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes that makes the gap between that person and the person they're dialoguing with even wider.
Yes. And it often gets that person entrenched in the position of there's nothing I can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
And why does anybody have to justify it in the first place anyway? Especially, there's a reason that this happens more with women in our culture, not one to one, but more so with women. Because depending on who you are and various things in your context and your identity and whatever, if you're angry, you can just say you're angry. Or if you say you're angry, people are going to be like, you need to tone it down.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to be able to, like, unless I can justify my anger, I can't say anything about it.
Yeah.
So there's a
and
reason.
then it turns into like, I'm angry over the past 10 years because of these 100 reasons, and there's absolutely no way for you to argue against it.
Yeah. When you tell anybody that they're not allowed to feel what they feel, or they shouldn't feel what they feel, or whatever, then you automatically put them into a position where they believe that there are things which are justified to feel and things which aren't. And what they're feeling when you say that isn't justified.
Yeah.
So we train, again, especially women, but certainly not exclusively. And there are other correlations with other identity markers and belonging to different groups and communities. More or less, we train people with less power, whatever. We train people to say basically, hey, if you feel anything or think anything that I, whoever it is that has more power, doesn't like, I don't want you to express that. And then at a certain point, other people come along and say, hey, it's bullshit that I swore. It sucks that you have been trained not to express those things. You are justified in feeling those things, and you are justified in expressing them, and here's how and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
And then that empowers people to express those things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still built on justification, meaning sometimes I'm angry and that's not justified and that's bad and that's on me. Sometimes I'm angry and it is justified because what you did is so terrible that it justifies my anger and that's bad and it's on you.
Mm-hmm.
And this third thing of sometimes I'm angry and that's valid and justifiable, and whatever you did that I'm angry about is valid and justifiable that you did that thing too, that neither one of us is wrong, even though I am angry or disagree or dislike or whatever, which is just the truth a lot of the time.
And this is when we circle back at 204 to baby Brandon and language and being a mediator.
Yeah.
You can't get anywhere as long as you're trying to argue over who's the one that's wrong. If it's got to be that I'm in the wrong or you're in the wrong, then we will spend all our time fighting about which one of us is in the wrong, and we'll never get to trying to resolve it.
And maybe solving complex global issues.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm talking about even like complex interpersonal, like who's going to do the laundry issues, you know?
Mm-hmm.
If it turns into a, well, you should because I blank, and no, you should because you promised, and instead of just, well, it has to be done and someone's going to do it. And here's some, like, let's figure it out.
Yeah. Who's got the energy to do it today? It
incentivizes something we call the oppression Olympics, which is when everyone's saying, no, I am more worn down and tired and burnt out than you are. And therefore, like a very common couples dynamic is whichever person is more aggrieved, more sad, more exhausted, the other person has to do what they want. And so then couples get into this place where unintentionally they're basically competing over who is more sad, who is more overwhelmed and exhausted and whatever, which means they're both sad and overwhelmed and exhausted all the time. Anyway.
Which is sad and overwhelming and exhausting.
Yeah. Your question about I am depressed, there are no rules to this, right? Like,
no.
When I say I am depressed, I don't mean I suffer from major depressive disorder, which is a biologically or, something which originates in our biology, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes people make that, though. Yes, sometimes people say I am depressed and they mean my brain is wired in such a way that I have no option but to be depressed.
Oh, totally.
And that's not super helpful for them,
Yeah.
But I'm kind of, I think I'm on record as advocating that we start to use autistic more the way that we use depressed, where
Mhm.
Is it associated with an identified, like clinically diagnosed condition? Yes. Do you have to be diagnosed with that clinical diagnosis in order to use the term? No.
No.
And are there ways? I know many autistic people who have no problem with the idea that sometimes they're feeling more autistic and sometimes they're feeling less autistic.
Mhm.
In terms of the clinical diagnosis, obviously that's not how it works. It's a diagnosis you have or you don't have. But I have yet to meet an autistic person who doesn't say something like, well, that's a very autistic moment for me, or I feel especially autistic when it comes to whatever.
Mhm.
It's a useful piece of language that I think is helpful to identify as, yes, being associated with a condition, and also separately, like, is a person allowed to say they're depressed even if they're not diagnosed with major depressive disorder? I think most of us would say, yes, that's an understandable and valid use of language.
Well, this was lovely, Marie. I want you to come to Northbrook sometime and you can cook for me.
Okay. Yeah, I have Boston cider. Thank you for your question. I have saved it, so maybe next week we can do a.
The very brief answer is you've got to focus on cutting things out, not doing more things, when that's the case, generally.
All right.
Brandon gave a brief answer.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah, I've never finished that thing of ideally you change it so you're not so crashed by the time. We're not meant to operate on a cycle of 8 hours of intellectual labor, then I crash for 4 hours, then I do some more.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever those people who are struggling that way say nobody else is doing this, they come home from work and they do X, Y, and Z. Yet those people are doing 2.5 hours of work.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing 6. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, my clients don't like it.
Maybe we can do an episode on burnout sometime and go into it in a bit more
I think that would be helpful for me.
detail for all of us.
Because we're in community and we're all a fractal.
Cool, like that.
This is when I become a particle physicist.
And I want to know what you mean by that, but I know we got to wrap up. I'll ask you later.
Also, I think there are like 10 different things we could follow up on with this. I think there are a lot of unclosed loops. But thank you for closing one, Brandon.
Yeah. Such as it is.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Marie. Thank
you for all of the comments.
Thank you.
I can't
And the
see
questions
them,
and comments in the chat.
that was
Thank
very-
you.
Take care of yourselves. See you next week.
Have a lovely week.
Bye.